Good evening, everyone. Welcome. The idea is, this is an old project, and I still intend to give this same lecture again in the future, to include more and more arguments from the Platonic dialogues. At New Acropolis, we have a reading group in which we read all the Platonic dialogues, and the intention was to create a summary of the main ideas from Plato's complete works. Today, I prepared a small sample, since we'll have about 50 minutes of conversation, and some of these main ideas are presented here. It's very common for those who already take the philosophy course with us to have an understanding of Plato mainly through the Republic and the laws which we study right at the beginning of our philosophy course, but not of the complete works he is credited with, although there are a number of dialogues that are somewhat debatable. 26 dialogues, plus the letters. So, it is a large body of work, voluminous and entirely preserved to this day. Despite how much he conveyed, we often remain limited, at times, to knowing only the allegory of the cave, without grasping a comprehensive view of all he shared through his work. The idea is to spark a conversation in which we explore general concepts. We will realize that much of what we have in the modern West, filtered through the Middle Ages, and later the Enlightenment, are Platonic ideas, which have been modified and distorted, but which originated from Platonic conceptions. I hope we can leave here with a more comprehensive view, a more global perspective on Plato, and a deeper understanding of his work. We will go over some general ideas and a brief biography, since people are quite familiar with it. We have just celebrated Philosophy Day, during which there was a tribute to the 2,400 years of Plato's Academy, celebrated this year. This academy lasted for 800 years. In other words, the school of philosophy with the greatest longevity in history, most likely, and one that profoundly shaped human thought. Well, take a look at a brief biography. I won't go into too much detail on that, and we'll go over some general ideas that have been drawn from various dialogues. Then we'll explore a few reflections from some dialogues, particularly the lesser-known ones, some that are not usually discussed as much, so that we can gain a broader understanding of Platonic thought as a whole. At the end, we'll open the floor for questions, if there are any. And I hope we leave here a little more familiar with Platonic thought, having come to know it better. All right? Everyone is somewhat familiar with the dates 428-347 BC. Everyone knows that he spent 10 years in the company of the one who has been historically regarded as his master, Socrates. It is also well known that he was not his only teacher. Plato acquired a great deal of knowledge from those we refer to as the pre-Socratics: Pythagoras, Parmenides, Heraclitus. In fact, one of his dialogues is titled precisely Parmenides. We also know that he drew heavily from Egypt. He inherited much from the Egyptian tradition. In short, it is a mixture of various knowledge, an amalgamation of diverse wisdom traditions. This young Plato, born in Athens, and from an aristocratic family, when the 30 tyrants rose to power in Athens after Sparta's defeat, one of those tyrants was Plato's uncle. Plato came from an influential family, as you know. When he was sent to listen to Socrates speaking in the public square, it was because his family intended for him to learn oratory in order to become a politician. They wanted him to pursue a political career. However, they sent him to the wrong person, wrong time, to the right person at the right time, depending on your point of view. From our view, it was the right person at the right time, because meeting Socrates, Plato fully left any other pursuit that was not philosophy. So, he was a young man from an aristocratic family, and his entire family had a history of holding positions in government of prominence in Athens. It has been said, though this is not well confirmed, that his name might have been Aristocles. Today, some argue that this was a fabrication, and that his real name was indeed Plato, but there is still the possibility that perhaps the name Plato came from the fact that he had broad shoulders, a wide back, and that this might have earned him his nickname. This too is not a confirmed fact. He was the most famous disciple of Socrates. It is well known that Socrates did not write anything at all, and that we know him primarily through Plato, and also, to a lesser extent, through Xenophon, another disciple who recorded the sayings and memorable deeds of Socrates. but the majority of the dialogues, all of Plato's dialogues, and most of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato. It is very important that we have a clear understanding, because it often seems, to those who are only slightly familiar, that Plato was merely a scribe of Socrates' ideas, which is not true. Of course, all of his works are a tribute to his master, but there is a dividing line. At a certain point, when we move beyond that phase of the early dialogues, in which Plato begins to follow his own pathes or his own ideas, even though he continues to honor Socrates as the spokesperson and central figure in all of his dialogues. So, although it is difficult, today, in academic thought, scholars distinguish one category the Socratic dialogues and another the Platonic dialogues. That is, there is the young Plato, who was still deeply influenced by his teacher, and the mature Plato, who begins to speak for himself. I, personally, am familiar with dialogues from both phases, and I find it difficult to clearly define where that line is drawn. I believe it is somewhat imaginary. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle, and although Aristotle followed his own path, you know that he was also one of the most famous students of the Academy. The death of Socrates impacted his life so deeply that he dedicated his work to honoring him. Perhaps Socrates would not have had the historical prominence or the recognition we have of him today if it weren't for Plato. Thinkers walking the streets discussing ideas at that historical moment was not something unusual. The fact that Plato chose to honor his teacher allowed Socrates to gain historical prominence, and perhaps we wouldn't remember Socrates as much as we do if it weren't for Plato. He would certainly be a much smaller figure in history. Plato founded a school called the Academy, widely known, and it was established in honor of the hero Academos. Here we can already perceive how subtle Plato was, although today we lack much of the symbolic perspective. Do not notice it. There are dialogues of his in which the main message lies between the lines. In fact, in our Thursday reading group, we recently read one of these dialogues, The Latches, which discusses courage. And its main message is found between the lines in the context. It is highly symbolic. He doesn't say much, but when he dedicates his academy to a hero named Academos, there are a number of things between the lines of that message. The hero Academos, who was very little known in our time, is the one who, when Theseus abducts Helen of Troy, her brothers Castor and Pollux go to Athens to try to retrieve her, and no one reveals where she is, except for Academos. This Academos, or Academus, far from the people, was the only one who disapproved of Theseus' rule in Athens. He believed that Theseus was a demagogue who flattered popular tastes, and that the people would eventually turn against him, which is exactly what happened. This populist habit of pandering to popular tastes, which was also very common in Athens at that time, is subtly criticized by Plato when he dedicates his academy, the name of the academy, to the hero Academos. So subtly, without saying anything, he says everything. Why Academos? Why not someone else? In a place so abundant in heroes as in Greek mythology? We know that most of Plato's works, excluding the letters, is estimated to consist of around 26 dialogues. I've brought here the names of the most famous ones for you, but that doesn't mean they are the most important, just the most well-known. Symposium, Phaedrus, Apology of Socrates, Crito, Timaeus, the Republic, especially the Republic. I recommend that if you ever have to go to a deserted island, taking just a few books with you. If you happen to remember my advice at that moment, take the Republic with you, because it's almost like an oracle. Everything you seek can be found in that book. It speaks of politics, it speaks of art, of how human beings engage with scientific thought, of education, of love, justice, kindness, and beauty. The thing it doesn't include is a cake recipe. Everything else is in the Republic. It's incredibly comprehensive. At first, the idea was to seek the concept of justice, and from that foundation, build a political model, which is his Republic, his public thing, residential publica. However, as the dialogue unfolds, they end up delving into an extraordinary range of topics. If I were to speak in detail only about the Republic, it could fill a culture series. It is undoubtedly one of the most important dialogues. It is in the Republic we find the allegory of the cave, so well known and widely referenced, and, I would dare to say, so little understood in its symbolic depth. Each part is dedicated to a specific theme, and it reflects the essence of dialogue that we have almost lost today. Several people gathering around a guide who proposes to engage in dialogue on a given topic. It could be about love, friendship, knowledge, or about justice. Many topics can be explored. It could even be about the origin of words. This guide takes on the responsibility of not knowing. He places himself at the service of the group, but he does not know where the dialogue will lead. He humbly embraces his ignorance about that subject. There is no manipulation of the dialogue, so that he does not take the group's arguments and start sewing them together, force a logical thread. Plato wisely said, and it is indeed a fact, that any group that gathers to engage in this kind of dialogue, while respecting the principles of dialogue, as we'll see later on, will arrive at a conclusion that transcends common sense on that very same matter. He regarded dialectics, the art of dialogue, as something sacred, almost ceremonial, to such an extent that, for example, in his ideal republic, he did not allow very young people to participate because he did not want dialectics to be used as a game or for arguments to be played with, because doing so is cruel. A person who knows to skillfully play with arguments is capable of dismantling all the beliefs of a human being, yet unable to rebuild or offer anything in their place. So, he disliked when words were used as a game, because words held a sacred quality. For Plato, he did not like seeing them used for amusement. For him, dialectics was a sacred discipline. All his books are written in the form of dialogue, and each one of them is dedicated to a specific theme. Now we will delve into the bold attempt I made to try to grasp some of the main ideas by considering Plato's work as a whole. This theory of ideas is certainly the one that, first and foremost, when one speaks of Plato, comes to mind. He says that everything that exists in the manifested world, which is the first part of the theory of ideas, everything that exists in the manifested world also exists on an ideal plane, where all ideas were originally conceived. The manifested world is like a mirror that gradually reflects the ideas brought from the ideal plane. The more perfect this transmission is, the more capable the person is who seeks and brings the idea. When this is done in a truly perfect way, it arises here below and gives rise to things of great perfection that meet the need for which they were invoked. If I need an object, I seek out a model and bring it forth in a very precise way, and that object perfectly fulfills the purpose for which it was conceived. However, if this transmission is flawed, along the way, the object suffers some damage, and when it arrives here below, it is damaged and incapable of fulfilling the purpose for which it was conceived. This sets off an entire cycle of pain and corrections throughout history, so that this object may eventually take the form it should have had from the very beginning. So, first of all, things pre-exist, since the universe was formed, in the world of ideas. Plato, the great challenge for humanity is to truly access that world. We will soon talk about this when we discuss the concept of the Demiurge, the bridge between these two worlds. First observation, things pre-exist in the realm of ideas. Second observation, even bolder, this world of ideas is the real world. This one here is the illusory world. It is a shadow. He says that this play of time and space, these changes in which nothing is permanent, do not belong to reality, but to a world of shadows. The world is illusory, and we have come to it to live an experience that is meant for us, to learn how to evolve our consciousness, to build a bridge between the two worlds, and, at a certain point, to cross that bridge, and ultimately return to the real world, which is the destiny of all beings at the end of evolution. But this is the illusory, pedagogical world, created so that beings here, looking through the shadows, could see their original form, and, through the longing for that original, which he called reminiscence, would return home. In other words, when properly understood, the things in the world are invitations to return home. The theory of ideas is essentially about this. I brought you a diagram that I found interesting because it clearly illustrates this. I won't go into detail, but it's one of the most well-crafted diagrams I found about the allegory of the cave. I found it quite fascinating. You'll notice that outside the cave, the lake, that tree, the sunlight, represent the real world, the world of ideas. And down here you have a likeness, an imitation of that real world, which is the cave, in which the fire represents the sun in the manifested world. Because the sun of the real world is the idea of the good. This is something very profound and thought-provoking. This perfect world of ideas that exists above is mirrored by what lies below. And the one who holds the place of the sun up there is the idea of the good. Here, inside the cave, in the manifested world, is just a small fire, the physical sun. He says that everything that happens inside the cave is a reflection of what happens up there, more or less perfect. And that, at a certain point, human beings will have to stop looking at the reflections, rise up, and move toward the source. Then they become wise when they no longer see only the reflections. But when they perceive real things in the real world, that is the wise person, one who sees things illuminated by the light of the sun. If the true sun, which is the idea of the good, as we often discuss in the philosophy course, is to see things illuminated through the good, then it is one of the most well-conceived ideas I have encountered from a symbolic perspective. It means looking at all things with the intention of understanding what is the good within them, without wanting anything personally, only wishing to benefit them. He says that this is the mark of the wise person, to look at things without trying to hold on to anything for oneself, but simply trying to understand what is the good in each thing, and to guide them toward the good that is proper to them. That is what the wise person would be. Then follows an entire sequence of ideas that are subordinate to this, because you will notice that in the body of Plato's ideas, the idea of the good is practically the cornerstone. It justifies all the others, everything flows from it, and wisdom also flows from it. He says there is a great dividing line, for example, when he speaks of love, and we will talk a bit more about that later on. Because, just imagine, each of these topics, anyone who took the philosophy course knows it is a full lesson. Each of these topics requires a full lesson. I'm presenting them in a summarized way. But at a certain point, he speaks about the dividing line in human love, which occurs when we stop looking at things and asking, what use is this to me? And begin to look at things and ask, how can I be of service to them? What is the good of these things, and how can I contribute to it? So, the relationship between human beings and the entire manifested world is established through the idea of the good. Through how much the human being has grasped this idea, he will be wise, fulfilled, and happy. And to the extent that he has not grasped it, he will experience the opposite unhappiness, frustration, and a lack of fulfillment as a human being. The theory of ideas is essentially this. There exists a perfect world, a world of ideas which is real, and it is a pedagogical world. It is not a false world, because that would be a pejorative term, but a pedagogical one, an illusion constructed, so that we may come to see reality through it. It is not about seeing things, but about seeing through things. You will see something very beautiful related to this idea he presents when he speaks about the idea of beauty. So, in addition to this first important part, the theory of ideas, I have selected a few others. You might say, wow, how is she going to talk about all of that? Very basically. Very basically, well, see that he defines almost everything. The idea of the good, the beautiful, and the just. He defines all of these ideas in one dialogue, which is the Republic, one I mentioned to you, as an oracle to take with you to the island when you become Robinson Crusoe. Laughter. Robinson Crusoe with the Republic is a whole different kind of technology, a different quality of life, because he defines all of these concepts. Within the Republic, just imagine they are basically the parameters for life. Because if you know and practice what all of this means, you have the parameters for life. Speaking in a very concise way, because that's what's possible. And it's our goal within a lecture. You'll see that he relates the good to unity, Iona. The good is that which unites. The beautiful is that which elevates toward unity. The beautiful always uplifts the human being toward unity, and consequently toward the good. And the just is that which brings order, placing each thing in its proper place. He connects all of these things as interrelated, Iona. That is, unity is the direction in which the entire universe moves. The universe came from unity and returns to it. Evolution always moves toward unity, in which each thing fits as if it were a great puzzle. Each being, when it finds itself, when it discovers its own identity, finds a form that fits perfectly with the rest of the universe. If your form is in conflict, it is because it is not yet your true form. When you discover your deepest identity, which is the know thyself, you fit into the universe in a harmonious way, because the universe is a cell of a greater unity. To evolve is to increasingly perceive yourself as a cell of a greater unity, and to work not only for the cell, but for the body. This is a deeply meaningful element, and it would be relevant in any reflection we might make about values, which is one of the most absent things in today's society. To be ethical, you must think as a whole. As a society, as humanity, selfishness makes ethics unfeasible. To be honest, you must think as a whole. As humanity, selfishness makes honesty unfeasible. Pause to reflect. What virtue, what value can coexist peacefully with selfishness? Selfishness is the antithesis of unity. It leads humanity toward regression. It leads humanity to what the Tibetan tradition calls the heresy of separateness. So, goodness is defined by unity. Goodness is that which unites, that which leads beings toward ever greater unity. If you consider the Egyptian model of the pyramid, you'll notice something quite interesting. Imagine that at the top of the pyramid lies the idea of goodness, and the higher human beings ascend. The closer they come to that idea, and the closer they become to one another as well. Right? As you descend, you grow more distant. If you want to know whether you're ascending or descending the pyramid, observe whether you are becoming more united, or more separated, more selfish or more altruistic. It is an infallible sign. It is a moral criterion for evaluating whether we are ascending or descending the pyramid. There is no way around it. So the idea of goodness is associated with unity. The idea of beauty, he said, was one of the most misunderstood in society even back then. Imagine today, many things can serve various functions within society, but beauty, necessarily, is which elevates human consciousness toward the good. This is a very interesting reflection. In a passage from one of the dialogues, not the Republic, you'll recall which one shortly, he says that beauty is not an invitation to possess something, but an invitation to renounce it. He says that true beauty is not finding this chair beautiful, wanting it for yourself and taking it home. We do not penetrate, we do not possess objects. They are not truly ours. This desire to have something for oneself may be an attraction, a passion, but true beauty does not give you that impulse to possess. It makes the object a symbol that leads you to something beyond it. Through it, you remember something. When you witness a beautiful act, a beautiful piece of music, a beautiful painting, it's as if, within you, there exists a longing, a reminiscence, a nostalgia, for a world in which all things are like that. It reminds you of something. It's as if you had once lived in a world where all these things have that same quality and are just as harmonious. Through beautiful things, you remember yourself. Through beautiful things, you find the way home. You do not desire beautiful things. He says no one owns anything in the material world. That is an illusion. And the desire to possess things is instinct, attraction. But it is not truly a feeling of beauty, because the attractive, beautiful, are two very different things. In beauty, you make the beautiful object symbolic and see through it. Your path of evolution and your own self. Whatever the truly beautiful act may be, or the truly beautiful object, it is a symbol that points you towards something higher. Beauty uplifts the human being, brings them closer to the good. And, as I've already mentioned, the good is the touchstone of everything. Justice is an even more complex idea, and even more beautiful. He says that justice has a lot to do with order, and that nothing in the universe is superfluous. All things have meaning, and have manifested to fulfill a purpose. They have a nature, an essence, and a unique role in the universe. Nothing is good or bad in itself. What makes something good or bad is how it is used. When things are in the wrong place, they become negative. When you find the right place, where all things are justified, they all find fulfillment. Finding the place where all things are justified is the role of the just person. Justice. Justice would be to give each one what corresponds to them, according to their nature and their actions. So, imagine that old example that we always use in the classroom. A knife. We cannot say whether it is good or bad. It depends on how you use it. In the hands of a good chef, it's excellent. But in the hands of a criminal, it's terrible. To find the place where all things are justified, even within ourselves, we talk about this a lot. Sometimes a stubborn attitude is nothing more than determination, projected in the wrong place, poorly directed. To understand the nature of things and to know how to give them the place that corresponds to them means to be just. To first discover your own inner nature and the place that corresponds to you as a human being within nature. Because once that is done, through correspondence, you will find the nature of each thing and give each one what rightfully belongs to it. With everything in its proper place, there is nothing evil in the universe. This is a profoundly metaphysical idea, because if there were something absolutely evil, the universe would have two absolutes, the absolutely evil and the absolutely good. Two absolutes? Then neither of them is absolute. They are relative. There can only be one absolute. Therefore, existence of something absolutely evil denies God, denies the positive absolute. It cannot exist. It is illogical. He presents an entire line of reasoning about this, about the necessity of giving to each thing what corresponds to it, to find the place where all things are justified. So these are three beautiful and profoundly important concepts. Can you imagine the power of this being lived out? In any society, at any point in time? The power of this being taken into account in the life of human beings in any society and at any time? Imagine how explosively relevant this is today, and how much we need this understanding in our lives. These are fundamental concepts. Let's move forward. There is still a lot of content to cover. The Demiurge and the creative human being. This concept of the Demiurge is fascinating because it refers to a divine being who, when creating the universe, built a bridge between the realm of ideas and the material realm, both constructed by him. He created a bridge between the realm of ideas and the material realm and brought it forth perfectly, in such a way that all of nature fulfills its role with precision and perfection. There comes a certain moment when, as reason awakens within the human being, he enters the category of a creative human, who, in a certain way, should also emulate this Demiurge, because it is also his role to create. And what should he do? He should possess enough moral stature to be, with his head in the heavens and his feet on the earth. He should be capable of grasping these ideas, exist on the plane of ideas, and building, in the material world, in their image and likeness. When a person lacks the moral stature for this, he creates distortions, and these distortions become sources of suffering. The Demiurge and the creative human being are like the biblical idea of one being made in the image and likeness of the other. Humans generate pain, suffering, when he lacks the moral stature to build that bridge, to be a pontiff, to bring into the world precisely what he perceives on the plane of ideas. Since needs do exist, he will fulfill those needs in a distorted way, in an inappropriate manner, incompletely, and the fulfillment of these needs in an incomplete way will bring unhappiness. He will even say, on a political level, that within a society, there are certain individuals, certain categories and professions that should necessarily be pontiffs. For example, the educator. Because if he does not perceive the plane of ideas, what will he shape in the world? Other examples include a legislator, an artist. Interestingly enough, these are bridges that require individuals with moral stature, or the damage to society would be immense. They are producers of forms, producers of elements that will impact society. They are creators of culture, of civilization, and if they fail to do so, all of humanity suffers, because those who cannot see, see through their eyes. That is what an artist, a legislator, an educator is. Those who cannot perceive the plane of ideas, see through their eyes. However, if they too cannot see, no one sees. Do you understand that? It's the idea that the creative human being is the image and likeness of the Demiurge. Interestingly, I always mention this in the classroom. Just recently, I was reading a book by a contemporary researcher who is a quantum physicist and who began to build some bridges with philosophy based on his laboratory observations. He was making observations within micromatter. You might know him. His name is Amit Goswami, and he has a book called The Physics of the Soul, where he talks of a topic like what we've discussed. obviously inspired by Platonic ideas, but also based on his own observations. He says that within micromatter there is an influence of the observer on the phenomena. Therefore, if you have, for example, a small particle and you film a process, it will behave in a certain way. If there is an observer, they will tend to interfere with this process, and the particle will tend to behave according to the expectation of that observer. He found this very curious and stopped to reflect on what would happen if several observers were placed in front of that particle. How would it make a decision? In the presence of so many observers, he arrives at a conclusion that is no longer laboratory Iona philosophy conclusion, and I found it very interesting because he says, when human beings are connected to a cosmic mind, they belong to the category of creators, and they influence the course of events. When they disconnect out of selfishness and begin to act only for themselves, they lose that category of creators and fall into the category of creations. Someone else thinks what they are. Someone else thinks what they live. They are no longer creators. A human being connected to this plane of ideas, to the cosmic mind, would also belong to the category of creator and would be capable of influencing the course of history. However, through selfishness, humans block themselves and falls into the category of created things, and someone else will think what he is living. He will fall into collective unconscious. Someone else will think the ideas he has, because they are not truly his own. They are all copied from some archive of the collective unconscious. So, this is very relevant today and would lead to many reflections. True knowledge and opinion. There are many dialogues that speak about this in various ways, in which he addresses the stages. One of the things he considers terrible is that when a man expresses opinions, he gives them the status of truth. When a man begins to give his opinions the status of truth, it means he has lost his love for the truth. It no longer matters to him. What matters more is the way he likes to see life, rather than how life truly is. I find this interesting, and to illustrate, let's use the movie The Matrix, which we recently discussed here at the school. By the way, who has seen The Matrix? Almost everyone, right? That's why I like to use it as an example. It's well known. We have that character who left the Matrix, saw how everything really worked, but out of convenience chose to go back to the Matrix and live in an illusion. Remember that? Do you realize that sometimes we live like this? That sometimes our opinions may not be very accurate, but they are comfortable? That they give us a sense of psychological comfort, which adds to the terrible inertia of change. He says that man clings to his opinions, gives them the status of truth, and gives up on the truth. And even when he suspects that his opinions do not correspond to the truth, he still prefers his opinions. Man settles into the illusory world and loses the drive to seek the truth. He says that this is dehumanization. A person who does not possess the thirst and the drive to seek the truth, who does not want to leave the matrix, is as if they have lost the fundamental characteristic of being human. Deep down, ultimately, there is something within us, a voice, that urges us to leave the matrix. Adapting Platonic language to our times. Anything else is secondary to this. And when a person trades this legitimate yearning of human nature to seek the truth for any other kind of toy, it means they have become dehumanized. And what follows from that is unpredictable. Society completely loses its direction, especially when those who have this kind of behavior are the ones leading society, because they will create a culture that institutionalizes it. These opinion makers shape culture. When they are not inspired by a philosophical search for truth, they institutionalize alienation. He basically speaks of these four categories. Aikasia is conjecture, which is pure opinion. You know that game where people usually say, I don't know, I don't want to know, and I hate those who do? Its Greek name is Aikasia. When someone says that to you, tell them they are practicing Aikasia. They want to understand a thing, but that's what it is. It's accurate. Pistis is belief. When a person takes a set of opinions as truth, and is averse to any kind of questioning. It goes a bit beyond Acacia, because at least a person has selected ideas and kept them, whereas Acacia is as volatile as the wind. Wherever it blows, the person's opinion shifts. With each season, they adopt a new intellectual trend. Belief fixes a set of values, but does so without any inclination toward inquiry. It simply takes ideas as absolute truth and is resistant to investigation. But at the very least, it has managed to fixate on something. Next comes dianoia, truth that is deduced, and already begins to emerge through reason. The individual starts to want to use a reason that is untainted. In an effort to uncover the logic of life, what is true behind the illusions. But of course, and he will develop this in his dialogues, that reason can only take you so far. It leads you to the exhaustion of appearances, but it does not reach the essence of things. It can reveal enough contradictions within appearances to show you that things are not quite as they seem. But to reach the essence of things, you must rely on intuition. Through a perception. That is deep, a profound experience of things, which he will call noesis, the truth grasped through intuition. This part is very interesting for those who have read the Republic or any other Platonic dialogue, because it is so common that in almost all of them there is a reference to this. He says that anything, and pay close attention to this, anything in your life or anywhere in the universe that has worked out well is because behind it there is a universal law. You can abstract from the facts themselves. If you have a strong symbolic and intuitive capacity, abstract from the facts and grasp the law that lies behind them. By doing this, you will be able to apply that law to anything in life, and it will work as well Iona. In other words, behind something in your life that worked out, you can abstract a universal law that can be applied to anything else in your life. I often share with my students a simple example that they know very well. But since there are some here who are not my students, I will tell this story again. We are volunteers at New Acropolis, as you know, and whenever we have a need, for example, to paint a wall, we do it ourselves. We built all of this here through collective effort. At the time this building was constructed, when we were painting the walls, there was something that was mysterious and deeply esoteric: the wall plastering. Anyone who has done it knows it's a bit unusual. A mason does it with extraordinary ease. But when you try, the plaster falls to the floor. Isn't that right? The plaster falls to the floor until, at a certain point, you find the right distance, the right technique, the ideal force, and the plaster sticks to the wall. The masons laugh a lot at you. It's quite funny, because they do it with tremendous ease. A mason will always be better than I am at getting the plaster to stick to the wall. But what can a philosopher take from that experience? If you realize that when you apply the right distance, the right intensity, the right focus, the plaster sticks, can't you abstract a principle from that to apply in any other situation? You're going to give someone advice. And that's exactly what happened to me. And it was quite interesting, advising someone who was emotionally a bit unsettled, a bit anxious, and I realized I had to let them talk a little, but not too much, so they wouldn't get too emotional and stop listening to me. Therefore, I had to wait for the right moment and speak in a way that she would take seriously what I was to say, not too forcefully so as not to offend. So I had to use just the right intensity. Speak with a certain gentleness, but at the same time with firmness. In other words, the right distance. If I could find that balance at the moment I spoke, it would work. What do you think I remembered? I find this story interesting because I saw it happen in practice in various situations, and it's nothing more than the idea of justice. The right intensity, the right time, the right place, that is justice. But notice that you extract from a practical situation something that will serve you throughout your life. This is much more than reason. It's an intuitive element that abstracts from anything that has worked in life, a general law that allows you to live better. Do you understand? To put it very simply, when he speaks of noesis, he means that human beings, through life experiences, abstract the laws of life. And the person who understands the laws of life masters it and can move through it successfully. crossing the bridge that leads to the world of ideas. This is very interesting and is a recurring theme, I repeat, in many Platonic dialogues. How to transcend, to use the mind first and foremost, and reach its highest and deepest levels, awakening something of intuition and symbolic vision. The theory of reminiscence. This is very interesting. Do you remember we were just talking about beauty? Beauty has much to do with reminiscence. He says the true beauty evokes a sense of nostalgia for home. It's like a memory of something you once had, some place you've already been, a memory of a place that apparently you've never been to, but you have. He says that if the human soul were born as a blank slate, empty, there would be no difference among people in terms of, for example, the tendency to be just, the tendency to seek truth, the tendency to have a vital need for coherence, the soul's thirst that drives some men to need coherence while others do not. He says they would all be the same in that regard, but men have different thirsts, and that has to do with the intensity with which they remember, because they've already been there. The level of remembrance will determine the level of the soul's maturity. If you remember, it means you've already lived something. Reminiscence tells us that the soul of man is endued with truth. Socrates, who was his teacher, used to say that education teaches more by what it removes than by what it gives. Remove all obstructions, alienations, opinions, vanities, those opinions you refuse to let go of because you've clung to them out of pride. Remove all of that, and what will come to the surface is the truth that is already there. In the Socratic dialogues, which were the practice of Eutics, if you asked Socrates something, he wouldn't give you an answer. It's not worth stepping into a time machine and traveling back 2,400 years, expecting an answer from him, but he would teach you how to find the answers within yourself. That's what he did. He would guide you through questions, and he would show the answer already existed within you from the very beginning, but that, due to a series of alienations, you had lost touch with that answer. Therefore, within the human being lie all the truths he needs. To learn is to remember. This is reminiscence. It is also a fundamental concept in the Platonic dialogues. He seeks to bring memory to the surface, and how much a person remembers will determine the maturity of their soul. This question of soul maturity is essential. Ethical dualism, absolute morality, which is logically inspired by the idea of the good because everything is inspired by it, and relative moralities. This ethical dualism in Plato, also very present in the political dialogues and in many others, states that absolute morality is the one that leads to a path that leads human beings towards self-improvement in order to reach unity. So what would a moral, ethical person be? Considering that morality and ethics are the same, it is someone whose conduct is aimed at bringing them closer to the good, bringing them closer to unity. And for that person, it becomes a decree that they impose upon their own actions. My decisions and actions must necessarily contribute to unity. They must contribute to a greater human group than just myself. They must be a factor of addition, contributing to the one. Even in mathematical operations, Plato says that addition leads you in the direction of the one. In other words, your decisions are a factor of addition. That is a moral decision. However, relative moralities are those we adopt because there is a law that punishes us, because there is an interest in creating an image, because we gain something from it. In other words, there is another end goal involved, which is not the good itself. This will never truly form an ethical human being. Once that interest disappears, so does their discipline in practicing that morality. Once they are no longer interested in the object you offered, their moral interest disappears. So what we are left with is a superficial facade-like morality, a kind of conditioning, and not truly an ethical formation. In summary, in a society where people do not seek the good, do not consciously seek unity, there are no ethical individuals, according to Plato. According to Plato, if you disagree, take it up with him. He'll give you his email address. For him, this is an axiom. If people do not seek unity, do not seek the good, they are not ethical, because ethics is not a game of interests. It is not a game of coercion that you play just to avoid being punished. or to avoid losing your job. That would be coercion, and if you were guaranteed that you wouldn't be punished or lose your job, would you do anything? The myth of Gyges is quite well known. Perhaps you've heard of it before. The ring of Gyges, the man put the ring on his finger, become invisible and do whatever he wanted. This man who, when visible, seems so ethical, would turn into a criminal once he wore the ring. So, was Gyges truly ethical? He had ethics for the English to see, as we like to say, of facade. If there is no deep pursuit of the good, of unity, a pursuit of being a force that adds value, a force of unity in the world you live in, if there is no systemic concern for humanity, no reflection on my actions impact humanity, and whether they could serve as an example of unity, if everyone were to imitate me, if there are no considerations of this kind, then this man is not ethical. He is merely trained to follow certain rules, serve specific interests. It is a social pact, as they say, but it's not an ethical society, because no one is truly ethical. That is training driven by self-interest. Similar to a dog that you train to perform various tricks, because in the end it will receive a treat. A circus animal. In essence, that's what it becomes. These are powerful and very timely ideas. How often do you hear about endless debates on ethics, about values, about the modern world that may or may not have ethics, that may or may not be corrupt? Plato's ideas possess a simplicity and a depth that are truly extraordinary. Who understands and applies them in today's world? Because they could very well serve as a final word, and I don't know anyone who has gone beyond that. I hope philosophers will come who will go further, because humanity evolves. But about this, I don't know anyone who has been so definitive. And when these ideas are brought to light, in the countless debates that society holds around ethics, they are not brought up because they would cause discomfort, since everyone accuses and is accused, and would feel they're all in the same boat. Because Plato's idea is very rare nowadays. It is poorly understood and even less lived. So, we live by a morality of conditioning, driven by social interests. We live by the social contract. For him, these are relative moralities, and can't call a person ethical, or an ethical society. Political dualism. In the Republic especially, but also in the laws, he is quite assertive. What is meant by the idea of perfect and imperfect states? He will say what happens to the individual also happens to society. It's something simple and clear. An ethical person leads a society to become ethical. A person of integrity leads it to become whole. A good person will lead it to become good. It's logical. In the same way, within yourself, we are all dual beings. And we have many voices within us. There is a voice telling you to be a person of integrity, but there's another that tells you to do whatever you want, because no one is watching. Which voice guides you in your daily actions? If it is always that human voice, you will follow a human path. If it is always the voice of inertia, of comfort, of instincts, of indifference, you will live a life that is animalistic, a life driven by instincts and very crude in basic interests. A human being becomes truly human when guided by the best within himself. Society becomes more humane when it is led by individuals who walk toward the highest within themselves, because, logically, they will set the tone for that society, just as the head sets the tone for the body. He says that a perfect state is one that is led by values, by virtuous individuals. From there, he presents a set of ideas. That is quite striking, because he lived in a society where this was no longer the case. So imagine in our times. He said that the men in power are those who please the majority, and not those who are guided by values. And that the majority would hardly understand values, because if they understood them, they live by them. Do you understand this? He gives an example in one of his dialogues. I can't recall now whether it was in the Republic or in the Laws. I believe it was in the Republic. He says to imagine a person who has to care for and manage an animal in a zoo, and who spends time observing what this caged animal does inside its enclosure. This person notices that the animal has certain habits. It always sleeps in one corner, always eats in another corner, at a specific time, and there is a particular food it prefers. Now imagine that, for some reason, this person has to govern this animal. and the animal must choose her as its ruler. She would create a political platform that would go like this. If I am elected, everyone will sleep in this corner, eat in that corner, this food, and at this time. Her political platform won't consider the well-being of the animal, but rather what it likes. Otherwise, she will not be chosen. Plato calls this demagogy. When, at a certain point, rulers think of themselves, and not of those they govern. Therefore, they do not lead them toward the good. He refers to this as an imperfect state. Now imagine an example I also often use in the classroom that helps relate to and understand this idea, Iona. Imagine you live in a small town, in the countryside, and in it there are about half a dozen pediatricians. Suddenly, the city hall announces a contest. The pediatrician who receives the most votes from the children will win a new car. They place the new car in the town square gazebo. Very tempting, very inviting. The children are going to vote, and you are a pediatrician running in the contest. You know that car could be yours. After all, there are only a few competitors. Suddenly, a child walks into your office, and you realize they have an acute infection. So severe that, if you treat it with oral medication, there might not be enough time, and the infection could spread and cost the child their life. They need an injectable medication, and fast. Do children like getting shots? If you give them a shot, will they vote for you? But they will live. If you prescribe a strawberry-flavored syrup, they'll like you, but they might not survive. What will you prescribe for this child? It depends on who you are. If you are truly a pediatrician, your main goal will be the child's health. They may hate you and cross the street when they see you, but they will be alive. Then you'll see them healthy and full of life. You will feel fulfilled by that without feeling a need or desire for them to like you. But if you are a demagogue, you will want them to like you, and what happens to them after will not concern you. Plato says that when the people who lead society are truly individuals who govern themselves, they will guide society along the right path, and, therefore, we will have a perfect state. When we project our vices and weaknesses, such as, and place in power people who are very similar to those they govern, we won't stand much of a chance. We would have a society in which all the pediatricians would end up harming the children, because their dream isn't the health of the children, but getting a new car. That would basically be the idea, a simplified example so you can understand. Continuing on, dialectics as the supreme science, the science whose object is the world of ideas. As I was telling you, dialectics as dialogos, two or more intelligences, seeking only the truth. For Plato, it is a sacred science. We have a group of individuals who are not interested in projecting their own personality, in showing that they know more, but who are humble enough to know that they know nothing. They have a love for truth. They will reflect on the experiences they have lived, without invoking authorities from the past. That is, in a dialogue, one cannot claim Iona that something is true just because someone said so. It is a dialogue in which the flow of life experience everyone has lived. Arguments are grounded in life itself, and not in intellectualism. Nothing is true by the argument of authority, just because someone said it. When a dialogue is conducted according to these principles, it comes much closer to the truth than the common sense previously held about it. So, the humility of knowing that one knows nothing, loving the truth, and working with arguments that are grounded in lived experience. Nothing is true just because you read it in a book, but because you have lived it. For Plato, dialogue was something that required great maturity because it was something capable of bringing one closer to the essence of being human, more than any other discipline. You will notice that not only are all of his works presented as dialogues, but also that all the teaching he offered within the academy followed this form. In his ideal city, described in the Republic, he allowed dialectics only for young people over 30 years of age. He believed that playing with arguments intellectually would empty words of their meaning, and that this would cause terrible harm to humanity. For him, dialectics is what builds a bridge to the world of ideas when reason can go no further. Since dialectics invokes Symbolic reflection, it invokes life. The union of various intelligences seeking a path. It is capable of going beyond what your reason could achieve on its own. It can lead you to cross the bridge into the world of ideas. This discipline was vital for Plato, but today it is not very well known. Education and the guidance of impulses. On education, he goes far, especially in a dialogue called The Laws. In summary, he says that education consists in using the impulses that every human being has to enjoy certain things and reject others. These impulses are shaped culturally in such a way that, through a culture that is somewhat distorted, you can be taught to enjoy a number of things that are harmful to your human nature and to reject others that are good. This leads to a distortion of character. He says education consists in taking the human impulse to like and reject, and guiding the person to enjoy what is good and reject what is bad in such a way that he moves toward the good, both as he should and as he likes. It becomes much easier. He rejects what is bad, both because he ought to and because he wants to direct human impulses so that they are inclined toward the good, and reject what is bad. This would be a proper formation of character, and would be the responsibility of education. He develops a long line of reasoning about the educator. The educator capable of awakening this in the student is the one who has awakened it themselves. He will embody what the student does not yet possess due to immaturity. But in order to embody something for another, one must first have it within oneself. He cannot represent something he does not possess. For Plato, the fundamental condition of an educator is that their consciousness be in contact with the realm of ideas, to possess values, virtues, because for Plato, technical knowledge was secondary. He says that the educator who perceives the needs of their student, if the student needs information out of love for their vocation, the educator acquires it quickly. But acquiring values is not so quick. Imagine the example I often give in class of a business owner hiring an employee. Today, when someone is looking for an employee, what is usually required? Technical experience in the tasks they will perform. They are expected to have a resume, to know how to handle computers, certain software programs, and so on. This person starts working, but who can ensure this individual with all that technical background won't, the moment you turn your back, if you're the business owner, steal from you or deceive you? Who can ensure he won't sell secrets to a competitor? Who can guarantee that? Now imagine that you hire an employee who is honest and has integrity, has the desire to grow, to serve, a person who holds strong values. Even if they know nothing about computers, you can enroll them in a course and they will learn. In 6 months, a year, they will learn. But have you ever seen someone take a 6-month or 1-year course in honesty? Is that even possible? A 6-month or 1-year course in integrity, in values? It's not possible. If a person lacks values, there's no way around it. However, if they lack technical knowledge, that can be addressed. For Plato, from the perspective of the educator, which is one of the most fundamental professions, they must possess values, a connection between consciousness and the realm of ideas, because that is not something that can be improvised. If it were, the public calls for educators would look very different from what they are today. For him, information is secondary. Formation is essential. So many truly original ideas, aren't there? And they were spoken 2,400 years ago. Yet we have barely begun to assimilate them. Love and moral virtues. I won't go into too much detail on this, but he says that love is always a union that arises from the essence of human beings, not from appearances. It's the idea of soulmates, of the two worlds. We have a physical world, to summarize the explanation, which is based on physical affinities, and we have a metaphysical world with metaphysical affinities. When you unite through metaphysical affinities, the more time passes, the stronger that union becomes. If you unite with someone because that person loves justice, and so do you, as time goes by, they draw closer to justice, and so do you. Therefore, you will grow closer to one another. But if you unite through mere physical or psychological affinity, as time goes by, those affinities tend to fade because both physically and psychologically, we change throughout life. And what was once very close at one point begins to drift apart, and the relationship becomes empty. In a loving relationship, as in all relationships within society, may people be a source of enrichment in each other's lives, and therefore unite from above, giving wings to one another. Do not come together to clip each other's wings, but rather unite around values, around metaphysical elements, around transcendent pursuits and shared ideals. This, in essence, is the idea of Platonic love, moral virtues, which I will not go into much detail about either. He says are the foundation that upholds society, and he speaks of some such as prudence, temperance, and courage, which are quite different from what we understand them to be today. Each one has a specific meaning. For example, courage, today seen as rashness. To us, the brave person is impetuous. For him, the courageous person is a lucid man, someone stays clear-headed in dangerous situations and makes the most appropriate decision. It is almost a reconstruction of all our concepts. Plato rebuilds the foundations with which we engage with life. And that is very interesting. He gives a new meaning to words, which, in truth, is the oldest meaning of all. Moving on to more important passages. I've brought you some excerpts that relate to Iona, a bit to the ideas we've already discussed. Excerpts from dialogues, other than the Republic. A bit from each dialogue so that you can get to know some of these ideas. Gorgias, which is a truly beautiful dialogue, by the way, not very well known, but very profound. It is always better to suffer injustice than to commit it. Interesting, isn't it? He says that the harm one suffers when committing an injustice is far worse than the harm one suffers when being a victim of that injustice. Being a victim of injustice takes away things that you would inevitably lose at death anyway. But committing an injustice takes away things that not even death. If a person is upright, if they are good, if they have values, not even death can remove it from him, but his lack of ethics is capable of doing so. However, if a person suffers an injustice, what can be taken from them? Their image? That image, with death, fades away anyway. Our material possessions, or even our physical life, all of that we would lose eventually with death. It may hasten the loss of things that were never truly ours, but it does not take away what is essential. Suffering injustice does not take away what is essential. Committing injustice does. Do you see? So, the one who commits injustice suffers much more, and he even calls upon us to have compassion for these individuals, because they are the most miserable. In a way, they should be the ones who most awaken our compassion, because they lose things that not even death could take from them, but they give them up through injustice. This is from the Gorgias. Now, the Cratylus. Cratylus is a short dialogue, very beautiful, that speaks about the origin of words. This is a passage from it, and thus the one who assigns the names does not contradict himself. He speaks of the lawmakers who created the names back at the dawn of these languages, which we have inherited. The one who assigns the names does not contradict himself, denoting under different names the principle of order and movement for virtues, and constraint and bondage for vices. What does this mean? He presents an admirable collection of names for virtues. Kindness, beauty, honesty, integrity, everything you can imagine. He traces these names back to their origins and discovers that the root of all virtue names is related to movement, flow, the act of moving. Then he examines the vices, goes to the root of each one and finds that they all relate to detention, bondage, being held back, and the names of the Greek gods. He explores their etymology and discovers that the Greek gods are those who push humanity toward movement, toward evolution, toward the flow of life, driven by the desire to become more than we are today, by the pursuit of the human ideal, of human completeness, in terms of values, virtues, and wisdom. Virtues push you in that direction, while vices hold you back. So, it's truly fascinating and invites deep reflection on this subject. In fact, just on this topic, one could give an entire lecture without any difficulty. The Republic. Education must provide the body and the soul with all the perfection and beauty they are capable of. Education brings beauty. to both body and soul, that is, it uplifts body and soul toward the good. As we've already discussed at length, both in relation to the good and to beauty. This one is also very beautiful, the Symposium, which is a dialogue about love and discusses the instinct to reproduce. A human being do not possess a reproductive instinct only in the body. The body generates new bodies to take the place of the old ones that have worn out. And this is a pursuit of eternity for the body, since it cannot be eternal in a physical sense. It replaces old bodies with new ones. But the soul has another way of procreating. It also has the same drive to procreate. He says, but there are some whose creative instinct resides in the soul, and who wish to procreate not through the body, but spiritually, giving birth to children that are of the very nature of the soul to conceive and bring forth. And what is it that the soul is naturally meant to procreate? Wisdom and virtues in general. In other words, perhaps that phrase we so often repeat about a man's life goals being to write a book, have a child, and plant a tree. Perhaps it's not only about physical children. Because to say that a man's goal is just to have physical offspring, well, all of nature procreates, and that's not particularly human. But to generate spiritual children, to bring virtues into the world, because when you build a bridge and bring a virtue into the world, even if it's small, even if it lasts only for a moment, you have contributed positively to the world. It was a child you left behind, and it will give rise to a lineage. This process continues because it sets a model. It is absorbed and embraced by others, and it allows other people to follow that path. We are still to this day impacted by the thought of Plato, who lived 2,400 years ago. What we are witnessing here are Plato's children, his ideas, and notice how they still reproduce, how they continue to bear fruit. May humanity not suppress this deep need to give birth from the soul, this spirit of soul procreation. Reminiscence. Whoever makes depend on themselves, if not everything, almost everything that contributes to their happiness, and is not bound nor altered according to the success or failure of their actions, is, in fact, prepared for life, is wise in the truest sense of the word, courageous and temperate. This is the principle of autonomy, which, much later, a thinker named Immanuel Kant would explore in depth. Autonomy means making your happiness depend solely on yourself. It means not allowing your happiness, a Buddhist principle, to depend on anything external. There has never been, nor will there ever be, a person who is only praised or only criticized from Buddhist Dhammapada. Therefore, do not let your happiness depend on either praise or criticism. In other words, circumstantial elements cannot turn you into a puppet. You must find within yourself all the reasons for your happiness and fulfillment. External elements, whether others recognize you or not, is secondary. As Confucius cited a thinker who spoke in a similar way. Do not worry about whether you are recognized, but worry about whether you are worthy of recognition. In other words, whether your own conscience recognizes you. However, the external circumstances that will make that happen or not depend on the world. But as far as you're concerned, your role has been fulfilled. It is about a person feeling at peace with their own conscience. A person who has an inner life, and once they achieve that, they don't rely on anything external. This is the ideal of the golden man that Plato speaks of, who depends on nothing external because he carries the gold within himself and does not depend on gold outside. All the wealth he needs, he carries within himself, and thus he is autonomous. And because he is independent of the world, because he does not depend on world, the world begins to depend on him, and he can begin to make history. He turns the game around. That is quite interesting. We have a long story that we could develop further on this, but I will leave it for another opportunity. And to those who have not yet taken the philosophy course, from this we could speak of many things. Fido. To learn is nothing other than to remember. If this is indeed true, there is no doubt that in a previous time we must have learned that which we now remember. Now, this could not happen if our soul did not exist somewhere before taking on, through birth, the human form. Therefore, for this reason as well, it is plausible that the soul is immortal. You may recall that Phaedo speaks about Socrates in his final moments, before being executed. Imagine a man who is just minutes away from execution. And instead of speaking about his fears, about existential fears, he's teaching his disciples why the soul is immortal. Calmly, engaging in dialogue with the hemlock waiting, and he continues to converse. He says if there are forms of knowledge we clearly perceive, were already with us. When we arrived here, it is because the human soul pre-exists human existence. If it pre-exists, then it also post-exists. I am certain that I did not come into the world empty-handed. I brought treasures with me. And if that happened, it's because I brought them from somewhere, where I pre-existed. Therefore, I will continue to exist with these things. My love for truth, my values, came with me and give me the certainty of eternity. That is the idea. Throughout this dialogue, he develops a series of reasonings to demonstrate the immortality of the soul, and this is one of them, truly beautiful. In fact, this is a magnificent book. Theaetetus. Here, the lack of loyalty lies in engaging in dialogue without making the necessary distinction between what is a proper discussion and what's dialectical investigation. Theaetetus is about knowledge, about science. And here he offers a critique of the way dialogue was being used, as the sophists used dialogue because they used dialogue for control. Just imagine, he had no idea how far this art would be perfected. Because today we have technology capable of manipulating through a pseudo-dialogue that is no joke. In the first case, the disputant amuses himself with his opponent and tries to deceive him as much as possible. In the other, the dialectician proceeds with seriousness and strives to uplift the opponent and to show him only the errors he has fallen into, whether by his own doing or due to poor guidance from other mentors. If you act in this way, your interlocutors will have no one to blame but themselves for their uncertainties and perplexities, not you. They will follow you everywhere and show themselves as friends, despising and fleeing from their former selves, to take refuge in philosophy and transform themselves into new beings, no longer continuing to be who they once were. See how nice that is? True dialogue gives a person the drive for self-improvement, to detest their own ignorance, and to desire to become someone new. However, if you do the opposite of this, as most people do, the exact opposite will happen to you. And instead of becoming philosophers or lovers of wisdom, you will turn your companions into enemies of knowledge as they grow older. A well-conducted dialogue leads people to become friends of wisdom and enemies of ignorance. It gives them the drive to sweep ignorance inside themselves and to become ever better human beings. It urges people toward the construction of their own selves. Very beautiful. Let's continue. The last one before we wrap up. This is a passage from the Republic. At the furthest limits of the intelligible world lies the idea of the good, which is perceived only with difficulty, but which, nevertheless, cannot be perceived without concluding that it is the primary cause of all that is good and beautiful in the universe. In other words, from the idea of the good comes all that is good and beautiful in the universe. All concepts and values can be defined in relation to it. The idea of the good is the highest inspiration that cannot be erased from the human soul without stripping from a person their very human nature. They would remain a rational animal, as we often say. This was essentially what I wanted to share with you, a brief outline. In the future, I intend to make everything more elaborate, including more content, in what would then become a cultural cycle. To encompass all of Plato's dialogues, there are many, but some general ideas of Platonic thought. As a whole, I believe I have chosen in a very strategic way, and I hope they are useful to you. Warm regards.